Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Annie Hardy in Austin, Texas. Annie is the founder and managing director at Zeet Insights, where she leads a team of market researchers and strategists. She spoke at South by Southwest with one of our recent guests, Erika Gable, on a topic that's very important, fighting sexism at work. Annie, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. It is an important topic and one close to my heart.
Well, I'm really excited to revisit this topic. I mentioned in our last episode, that we were going to be covering this really sensitive topic. We're going to revisit some of the same topics. And again, our goal today is going to be to both enlighten and empower both men and women on this really important issue. So I'm excited to get started. So my first question, Annie, is what do you think is the biggest misconception today about sexism at work?
I think that one of the biggest misconceptions is that people confuse sexism with sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is more of a forward, a visible, more aggressive form of sexism, where people feel at risk, or there's a physical element, or there's an offensive element, and it's very, it's easier to identify. And so when people think sexism, they think sexual harassment. But what happens is occupational sexism in the workplace, can be far more subtle. Biases in the workplace and the way that those are exhibited can be far more subtle than what sexism in sexual harassment is identified as.
Wow, that's a really great point. I'm curious, when you talk about those two things, they're obviously overlapping, but on the sexism side that's not sexual harassment, what are some maybe examples of that you've seen?
Well, it can be kind of very... for instance, there can be a woman on a team with a lot of men, and the men are invited to go play golf, and the woman is not. It can be they are excluded from activities. It can be a woman in a room who has an idea and isn't given the airtime or isn't given the credit for the idea that she had. Her voice isn't as loud as it should be given her role. It can also be physical. There can be men that are taking over the room physically and not giving a woman who may be in a leadership position the opportunity to have more of a physical presence. She may be expected to take notes. She may be expected to clean up in the conference room. Or on the flip side, sexism could be a sales team that judges a man who is in marketing, saying marketing is for women. It could be a team of women who go out for manicures and exclude a man. So it's not simply a man judging a woman or having bias towards females. It can be females having bias towards females or against males. So there's a lot of misconceptions about sexism being simply bias of men towards women, when in fact it's far more complicated.
I totally agree. I'm actually in a car club. And I know that's probably sounds strange, but my very first job, I worked redesigning parts on cars. And so I really have a love for cars. And when I go to dinners with the car club, at least especially when I first joined, first of all, everyone assumed I was the spouse of someone who had a car. But I got kind of pushed over to talk to the women, about things like cooking in a corner versus the men were talking about cars together. And I was like, man, this is such a bummer. This is not why I came, to this event sort of a thing. But I've observed, you mentioned golf, like women maybe not being invited to go play golf. I have observed a similar type of situation. I worked at a place years ago where there was a book club that was taking place at work during work hours that was a men's only book club. And I think, and women would ask to join and we're told no, that, this is a men's only club. And I think sometimes I've heard the response of like, why does it matter? Like, why does it matter if all the women get together and get their nails done? Or why does it matter if all the men get together and have a book club? And from your perspective, why does it matter?
Well, one of the reasons it can matter is a feeling of exclusivity doesn't build the ability for teams to function together. For instance, decisions are made on the golf course. Relationships are made on the golf course. And those are the relationships where people are supporting you, the relationships with people that are senior to you, that are fostering your personal growth and encouraging you to take risks and take positions. And so being able to advance your career by being in those rooms is important. Being able to connect in an emotional way with people that are on your team is an important perspective, but also breaking gender perspectives so that you can be seen as a voice. So having your voice present in those spaces enables men, or in the case of women, to be able to understand the importance of your presence.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. You mentioned voices. I had a friend recently tell me they work at a big tech company, and they had a woman share a situation with them that really blew them away. This woman had been in a business meeting with a group of other people, and she was, pulled up to the table. And when they asked for opinions, she shared hers just like everyone else in the room. And after the meeting, someone pulled her aside and said, "Hey, listen, I just want to let you know you're not in that meeting to share your opinion. You're just there to observe and to be there." So even though she had a job that required her to have this opinion and required her to provide input, she was literally told, "This isn't why you're here. Stop talking."
Yeah, I think it's important for women and men who observe that. We have three different roles in sexism. One is the actual target, the target of the sexism itself, whether a man or a woman. One is the initiator. This is a person who initiates or instigates the situation. But that third person is the champion. And the champion's role, when they're observing something like that, is to stand up and say, "This is not okay." That's an important role in the workplace, and I would hope that somebody who was aware of that, to whom the target actually confided, I think that that's an important role to step up, because what will happen is that in the workplace, people are forced into gender roles that are unfair, that are not true. And I think that that's a really complicated situation, especially if the person was senior to her, especially if she had a junior position. I've had men in the workplace. I'm, pretty firm. I'm pretty direct. I'm from Texas. We're direct here. And I would be direct in meetings, and I've had men who complained to my boss that I was overstepping my role. So I've had something very similar happen, where that's because I'm a woman, and they don't expect women to be that strong. It's similar to any time a woman is in politics. It seems that she is, and Hillary Clinton is a great example. People talked about how she was almost manly, and the idea that her voice was not feminine enough for their perspective of what a woman should be. And so I think that also men, when they go into the workplace, if they aren't firm enough, they are seen as weaker. And so I think it goes both ways. So the champion role in that situation is important. People raising it that it didn't happen to, that listening to the situations, and women or men who view sexism in the workplace, confiding in each other to build a perspective of the patterns that are happening to bring it to management. That's important. So if something like that happened, the recommendation we would have is that you write it down. You actually send an email to yourself or sketch it out, tell yourself what happened, send it to your boss, and track it, document it. Because once a pattern develops, that's going to make a more powerful validation for HR to take action on.
Yeah, I think it's such a tough thing to kind of deal with. You mentioned, I love that you broke it up into the target, the initiator, and the champion, because that's a really clear sort of way to look at it. I had a friend recently observe something in a workplace where a man sent an email to a woman, and I wish I had more examples in the other direction because I know this happens both ways, but a man sent an email to a woman that was very aggressive. And then he forwarded it to this third party, this champion, I guess you could say, in order to brag that he'd been so aggressive to this person. And the champion confided in me that, wow, I really don't think he would have sent this email to another man. I think he was being really aggressive to this woman on purpose. And it's just so hard because in this situation, this champion didn't have any sort of skin in the game. Neither of these people reported to them. There was no sort of real connection. And so I think that champion was saying to me, how can I help out? Like, what can I do that will actually make a difference in this situation?
So what we talk about is, we break it into roles, and that champion is important. But when we break it into action, what we look at is we look at a couple of different options for people. It's important in this situation to respect and acknowledge the fact that conflict, like you're going to create friction if you mention it in some context. That takes bravery. It takes courage. It's uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable with the idea of discomfort to step into these spaces. And so what happens is you have a couple of different times at which you can respond and a couple of methods. One of them is a direct in-the-moment response, where you're in the room and you say, that's not okay. Or you're in the room and says, hey, wait a minute, she just said a good idea, let's go back to that. Or he just said, a great thing, let's come back to this idea. So that's the in-the-moment response. So you can go directly to the person or that is the initiator, or you can go to the target to say that again. Wait, what did you say? Can you repeat that? Another option is after the moment. After the moment, you have a couple of things. You can go directly to the target to say, I heard that. Let's talk about what we can do. You can go directly to the initiator's manager to say, he said this or she said this, it's not okay. Or you can go directly to HR. Typically, when you're going to HR, what we recommend is that you have enough documentation. That's why documentation is important. They have to see a pattern that's developed to be able to build enough of a case to do something like putting that person on a plan or really addressing it. And so typically going to the manager or going directly to the person is a great thing for the champion to do. But once again, some people are very audacious. Some people are very, very much external. They're extroverted, and they are not conflict averse. And they can speak in that moment, or they can go even after the moment directly to that initiator to say that wasn't okay. But we want to be respectful that some people in the moment don't know what to respond except for what I call an uncomfortable laugh. That's kind of our go-to. People have our go-to. They roll their eyes, or they just shake their heads. And some have said that's not an okay response. And my perspective is sometimes that's all you got. And so what we encourage people to do is actually, if you see a pattern develop, practice a response. For instance, in the golf situation, the woman doesn't get invited to golf. She just doesn't. So she could go to the salesperson or go to the man who's coordinating the golf trip and say, hey, I would love to drive the cart next time. That's what I'd love to do. And so she can practice that response and actually go to that person after the moment or even in the moment and raise her hand and say, hey, I'll drive the cart, and invite herself to it. And if they're uncomfortable with her there, they need to become comfortable because she's part of the group. So practicing responses, looking at what those situations are, seeing if you can add humor to it perhaps to say, hold on, that's a good idea, let's go back to that. Practicing those responses is something we recommend, especially for people who are conflict averse.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something which you just said it, and I believe you said it at South by Southwest during your panel, which was the response of, say that again? And I had never thought about that, but when you say to someone, say that again, they actually kind of have to think about what they're doing in the moment. And I'm wondering, have you tested that out before, and how does it work?
I have the benefit of owning my own company. And I have the benefit of when I come in a room, people expect me to be the expert. They expect me to come in the room. And so I have almost escaped some of the sexism that happens because of my authority in the rooms that I step into. Now, what we did is we asked women how they respond in those moments, and that's what one of the women said, who is still in the workplace in a corporation, who is still dealing with this. And we asked people, so how do you respond? And some people said, well, I'm an investment banker. I have to respond in a way that doesn't exclude me because I am not playing the game. I have to play the game. And so I just respond with humor, kind of like that laugh, like, okay, dude, that's not okay. In the other context is the woman that we talked to who was uncomfortable. And she said, what I do is I say that again. And they say it again. And she said, say that again. And they say that again until they become uncomfortable. And so she has used that before. I have never had to since she told me that, because once again, I have the benefit of owning my own destiny and my own role. But there are other people who are, bold enough to make the initiator uncomfortable. That's really a bold statement. That's a bold position. Not everybody's comfortable doing that. So I myself have not had to, but we did hear from women who have.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, so, as we kind of think back on this, I feel like we're starting to talk about it. I know I'm talking about this issue more than I probably was 5 years ago, for example. I'm curious from your perspective, why do you think, well, I would say first, do you agree with that? But why do you think we're talking about it more today than we have in the past? What has sort of brought it back to the forefront of our minds?
I personally think the anonymity of digital communications was a catalyst for this. I believe that people were able to voice their concerns and see that patterns were developing and see that things were not okay and have communications with people all over the country or all over the world suffering from similar things. So I believe that the digital revolution and connections people were making on digital were the catalyst initially, developing relationships, chat rooms, communities of women that struggled with this and suffered with this. For instance, in the Texas legislature, in both Democrats and Republicans, there were women who entered the legislature in positions, and what they found was there were certain people, certain men, that made them uncomfortable, that did things were very sexist, that treated them in a way that wasn't fair, that wasn't comfortable. And what they did was they created a Google document, a spreadsheet. And in that spreadsheet, they actually put the names of men that people needed to be cautious with or avoid being in the room with. And that was a collaborative piece of content. That was a collaborative document that women were able to document what happened, and they were able to use it to avoid those situations with those men. And so I really believe that digital, enabling people to connect beyond just their in-person voices, is enabling women and empowering them, and even men, like what we call allies, to be able to understand the importance of this role. The Me Too movement is a great example. People connecting with their stories and saying, this is what I suffered. I was part of the Me Too movement, and when I shared my experiences, the people on in my digital community and were shocked. And I said, hey, yeah, I'm a very strong woman, and this is a part of my history, and people were shocked. I think it's important to shock people. People do not understand. They don't understand what sexism looks like, but now digital has empowered the voices to be heard. And the anonymity of digital, where you can say, this happened to me, builds a groundswell movement of awareness. I think that is what is allowing people to connect and communicate their experiences to build an undeniable perspective on the growth of this.
It's a really interesting sort of thought. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I think you're right, though, because when you're able to share things online and there's not as much of a consequence, like a negative consequence, it's easier and you can build that community and you can really have, not be alone. I think one thing that sort of became clear as people started sharing their stories, for example, in the Me Too movement, is that most everybody had a story. It wasn't, these just one-off things. And so I think that was probably one of the biggest lessons. I think, though, like looking back at some point, the question I have been asked, which I don't have a great answer to, is that sometimes, especially like with public figures, when they're identified, we are able to, like social media also enables us to sort of have this mob mentality where it's almost like a public lynching of this figure before they've really truly gone through a process to sort of, vet out how guilty they are. And I don't know. It's interesting because I think in one way it's the internet is empowering these voices to be heard. And on the other hand, it's like, is there a middle ground so that not everyone is totally subjected to having their life ruined so quickly? I don't know. I think it's a tricky balance.
I agree, and I know that this is not the topic that we're covering right now, but what women have struggled with in proving that they've been raped when they do say, I've been raped, is a very similar thing. Mm-hmm. What happens is that they will say, I've been raped, and if they don't have enough proof, enough of that documentation, the idea is, did it really happen? And the public response and the exclusion and that what you're talking about, lynching, is a risk, absolutely. And that's why documentation is important. I believe, to your point, that sometimes this unfairness is going to occur, just point blank. And when people are dealing and struggling with sexism from a documentation perspective, that's why the targets, we want them to document. And if they're struggling from an initiator perspective and being, kind of in this position, they should request documentation. Sometimes people in the initiator position don't understand that they're being sexist. I think that's so common. I think that, once again, sexism is far more benign than sexual harassment. In sexual harassment, you'll have this, more aggressive situation. But sexism is far more benign today in the office, often in the workplace. And so that's why documentation is crucial on both sides to protect both sides of it, and why identifying what sexism is, which was what we have tried to do, what does sexism look like occupationally, that's important for workplaces to do. They do sexual harassment training. They do not do sexism training, or like recently Starbucks did racism training. And the idea is ageism even. Ageism is a problem. So no matter what the bias is, companies are moving towards that education piece, trying to help people navigate that, trying to help people change their mentality and their responses. But to your point, there are going to be failure points. This is going to be something that we have to adapt to, and it's going to take a while. It's going to be sticky. It's going to be difficult. So we should expect that, but at the same time, requesting that documentation is a fair response.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting you mentioned that a lot of times the person who is the initiator may not be aware that they are the initiator. And I think, I've been in tons of situations at work because I've very often been one of the only women in my workplace, wherever I've been. And, I've experienced sexism from people who were trying to be polite to me or who were trying to be nice to me. And I think sometimes it's almost like a cultural difference, and maybe where they grew up, one way of behavior is more normal, and where I grew up, maybe something else is more normal, and we haven't decided what's the norm for the corporation that we work for. But I'm curious, like from your perspective, do you see this kind of situation where someone is actually trying to be polite, but in reality it's being perceived as being sexist?
Oh, my goodness. Absolutely. I had a conversation with a colleague from Italy a couple of months ago, and she was complaining about men opening the door for her. I'm from Texas. My husband is from Mississippi. I have a lot of friends that actually are Southerners, and that's part of our culture, calling people ma'am as a sign of respect, opening the door for women. This is something that is ingrained within them, but people who are not from that culture are often offended by that. So there are definitely cultural norms that offend certain people and do not offend others. And I'll be honest, that's tricky for men to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
That's tricky for women to navigate. What is the expectation, and what is right or wrong? What I find is that some women, I feel like they are unreasonable in their expectations of what men should know and should not know.
Mm-hmm.
That's important for women to navigate. And that's why it's important for a conversation to develop so that everyone is accountable to defining it. What does it look like? What does it not look like? And educating and informing people in the workplace of how to navigate it. I think that, once again, women expecting without communicating what their wishes are is a failure point in addressing sexism in the workplace.
I totally agree. It's interesting, like if we're listening and we're thinking to ourselves, wow, I really do try to treat everyone equally, but God, I don't know where the lines are. I mean, I'm not really sure. Like maybe we're one of those people who's opening doors and we're like, wow, is this a problem? Is this, not a problem? I mean, how can we sort of figure out like what's normal, what we should and shouldn't be doing?
I think stories play into that. I think telling stories and being really transparent in the workplace, and it's crucial for HR to drive that conversation. Human resources needs to step up. They need to step up to be bold and address this in the workplace, understanding that it's a problem. There are companies who are doing a lot more with trying to become diverse, but pulling people into your organization for the purpose of meeting your diversity goals does not address the fact that they, for the most part, are maybe joining an environment that is still full of people that are different than them. And so what you've got to do, especially if you have diversity initiatives in your hiring strategy, is you've got to take this head on. And what they're finding, and there was, when they're looking at South by Southwest, there was a company that was doing research at South by Southwest looking at the biggest corporations in America, talking to those leaders and saying, what do you want to see more of? What do you want to address? Same thing with HR. There was recently an HR conference, and they asked the same thing. They're like, what is your focus? And equity and equality in the workplace and sexism and racism are on the forefront of their concerns, but they're not equipped with the tools they need to address it. They're not fostering and facilitating those conversations internally. And without that conversation, that candid, transparent conversation where people can express their concerns and tell their stories, people of the opposite sex or people who struggle with internalized misogyny, which is when women have a perspective of who women should be and judge other women, internalized misogyny, without people telling their stories, and once again, the digital piece comes in, people on the other side aren't going to understand what it looks like because it is different for all the people. And people in the target perspective aren't going to understand what people of their own sex or gender feel about sexism and how they differ in their definitions. So I believe that communication and facilitating of those conversations is crucial, but it's not happening right now. HR teams are not equipped. No one's doing that, or at least if it's happening in very sparse, very largely, highly lauded examples like Starbucks, who is finally addressing sexism or racism in the workplace. Let's figure out how white people can treat people of color. This is still a revolution in people not only identifying bias, but trying to change perspectives. It is a long, hard journey. It was a long journey to women getting the vote. It was a long journey to people of color being able to sit at the same tables that Caucasians were sitting at. And now it's a long journey for people to change their internal biases and to want to change.
I think you're right.
Start with humanizing the issue.
I think you're right. And I think communication is really key. I often share a story that I once had a job interview with a big company that we would all know. And I won't name drop today, but I had an interview with someone there, and the person interviewing me was a C-level executive. And one of their first questions to me was, are you married? Do you have any children? And do you plan to have any children soon? And anytime I share that story, people say, wow, those questions are obviously illegal. How would someone ask you those questions during an interview? How would they use that information to decide whether or not to hire you? And I always think back and I think, as much as we talk about what you're not allowed to ask during interviews, I've never actually heard of an HR team actively training hiring managers on what not to ask. I think there's an assumption that we all know the rules and that we're all on the same page. But if you don't communicate what's normal, how can you expect people to know what you don't want them to ask? I think there's a lot of assumptions going around, and our assumptions are based on what's normal to us, not on what's normal to the other person.
I think in response to that, I've had a similar situation where I was talking to a gentleman who was planning on expanding his business operation from Brazil to the United States, and he was looking at somebody to facilitate this consulting practice in the United States, and I was having a conversation with him, and I mentioned that I had children, and he kind of stopped, and he's like, well, how are you going to manage that with the travel? And I was like, dude, I'm okay. I'll figure it out. It's all right. But I think in that workplace, there are a couple things that stand in the way. One of them is in interviews, you want to get on the good side of the hiring manager. Mm-hmm. And what that means is, in many situations, it means developing a warmth and a comfort level in the conversation, kind of connect emotionally with the hiring manager, not only professionally. You want to join the team. You want to, build a relationship with them so that they think you're the right culture fit. And then what happens is once you develop that warmth, the hiring manager gets comfortable enough to ask you this question to see if you would fit in with the culture fit and the culture expectation that you're going to work 60 hours a week. And then they judge you because of their gender roles that they have in their head that you should be a mom, maybe because their wives are moms and their wives stay at home. I've had that very frequently. Men who have stay-at-home wives more than often judge me in a very silent way about whether I'm a good mom or not. I have another example of what happens with men in the workplace when HR does reach out to them, perhaps. I call it the circle of influence. How deeply do executive men and executive women even, allow HR to speak to them as authorities in their roles? How open are those executives to listening to HR and changing their perspectives? They're very successful. They are very informed and very educated. And are there people in HR that have the credibility and the trust and are in the circle of influence of that person, for that person to trust what they say and change the way they've always done things? And I think that's a thing that executives need to question. I think it's a role that coaches play is separate than the actual internal, like coaches like you, instead of just the internal HR department, and looking at who's receiving the complaints, who's bringing them to management, and whether that person has the credibility to drive change in the operations of that executive. I see that as a weakness of human resources, but also in the executive suite.
Well, I think you make a good point. So I don't come from an HR background. So I frequently talk a little bit about some of the roles that HR plays in our lives when it comes to a big corporation. And I think the word credibility is pretty important. Very often, I think HR can be perceived as sort of a babysitter or a box checker or, a lot of negative things. And if HR really wants to have that influence, they need to create that seat at the table and get buy-in from the other departments to even hear this message. Because otherwise, I mean, I don't know. I think they are often a department that is not always taken seriously, and sometimes for good reason. So yeah, I think credibility is pretty key. Well, I think there's one other thing I really would love to touch on, which is, very often people don't speak up about sexism at work. Like, if it happens to you, it's a really tough thing to speak about and to talk about. And from your perspective, why do you think it is that people don't speak up more about this issue?
I think very often there are definitely several reasons people wouldn't speak up. One is that they may be conflict averse. Two is that the situation may be happening with a senior person, a person that's senior to them, and they're more junior, and they want to develop their career, and they don't want to be identified as somebody who's causing trouble, because that has happened. People have been seen as kind of whistleblowers on sexism, and all of a sudden their career opportunities to advance are stifled because they're not being seen as team players. I think part of the reason is they don't know how to respond. Even if they see a pattern, they don't confide in people to say, this is what I'm suffering from, what do I do? So they don't necessarily have a network of support within their organization. Another is they bring it to HR, and HR does nothing, which is honestly, if they don't have documentation, they haven't developed a pattern, HR doesn't have enough internally to make change often. And so that's why they may have said something in the past, but nothing was done, and so they don't trust that these entities are going to do something. I know of women who have suffered sexism in the workplace, and they just leave. They just find another job and go away because they say, I deserve more. I'm just going to leave because I don't trust that they're going to deal with this. I've heard other people have mentioned things and they're not going to deal with it. Nobody stands up for me. I'm not valued here. I'm going somewhere else. And so the talent gap that some of these executives are suffering is in part because sometimes of the internal biases that people suffer that they don't feel comfortable addressing, or they don't feel like it's going to get addressed. They don't have any confidence that it's going to get addressed, and that's based on their experience and what they've heard from others. So I think one is the personality piece, being conflict averse. One is it happening with seniority. One is feeling like they're the only one. There's another where their professional development is at risk. And then that last one is really they just don't feel like anything's going to happen based on their experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's interesting. At one job I had earlier in my career, there was a particular executive that was fairly high up, and he had a pattern of behavior towards people who worked for him, right? And so there were a string of people who spoke up, and went to HR and said, this is happening to me. And it was actually fairly well documented at the time. And I believe pretty much every person who spoke up was either displaced or was asked to leave the company, because this executive was someone that was a high producer, that was talented and smart and brought all the things to the company that the company really needed at that point. And so I think it really created an environment where, if you talked about the problem, you were the problem, which is really, really tough. And I hope that that's changing. That's been sort of my perception. And it's interesting, you mentioned women who sort of just move on. I recently interviewed a guest, Margaret Heffernan, and she is based out of the UK, but she's also from Texas, interestingly. And she's, was an executive years ago, so she's a little bit further along in her career. And she said to me, I never took it personally, but I realized back then that this wasn't something that I could change. Like, I couldn't necessarily change their perspectives, and it wasn't personal to me. So I just chose to move on to a place that would appreciate my talents more. And for her, I think it allowed her to go further in her own career, just looking for the right environment instead of fighting with the wrong environment. And I don't know, like philosophically, if that's ultimately the best answer for everyone, but I think that was a really an interesting perspective from someone who, didn't want to make that their life's work to fight this battle.
What's interesting is I've heard the same thing from people of color. Once again, bias is across the board. People of color have fought for a long, long time to try to get a voice. And women have fought as well, but people of color have fought for generations. And they say, I'm not going to fight this battle, I'm just going to go. My voice is not important, I just accept it. They just accept that bias is going to be present in the workplace and they will be treated differently. And so HR departments need to do more. With the example of Uber, venture capital companies that are investing in these startups, any acquisitions that are happening, there is a risk that if you invest in a startup that has bias issues, like what happened at Uber, the value of the company could fail. The value of the company could decrease. The relationship and reputation of the company could suffer. So what I do is I actually talk about the human factor of acquisitions to investors. I'm like, is this a problem? Is there bias? Let's explore that to figure out if that's a risk. Because, to your point, people have just kind of accepted that this is the way things go, and they've done it for too long. They're trying to acquire and retain this top talent at the risk of their diversity initiatives failing, or at the risk of not caring about diversity initiatives, or just having them as token people that you bring on board where you're not really bringing them into the culture of the organization, which is what I think is happening in Silicon Valley. I believe that some of what's happening in Silicon Valley is that there are token diversity initiatives that are not well established in weaving in people in the culture of the organization by changing the mentality of the people around them. When they pull people in, from a diverse perspective, are they changing the minds of the majority, or are they expecting the minority to change? And what I see is happening is the minority is expected to adapt to the culture rather than the alternative, rather than putting people who are the majority in a position where they understand and empathize with those who are different than them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a really important topic, and it's one that I typically tend to stray away from. But I'll be honest, I was recently emailing with a professor about topics, kind of in this general realm. And that professor made a really great point to me, which is that people who are in power or people who have voices really have a responsibility to speak up for those who can't. And so I do think that this is an important discussion. And I'm so glad, Annie, that we were able to take the time today to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
And I'll say one last closing thing. In my career, there have been 7 executives who have realized my potential and kind of fought as allies for me within the organization. 6 of those 7 have been men.
Mm.
And so it's not that men are not allies and men are not engaged. It's not that the majority of men are the initiators of sexism, but because there are men in the executive suite far more often than women in most industries, what's happening is that there are those golden few that are literally making spaces for us, that are literally telling the C-suite, you need to have a conversation with Annie. Annie's smart, she's savvy, we need to find a way to use her. She's going to make this company better. Let's talk about where to put her. So once again, 6 of those 7 were men. And so the men that are listening to your podcast, and even the women, the idea of connecting with allies and asking mentors to engage you is part of what workplaces can do to foster growth and the voices of women who may have suffered sexism. You have to ask, you have to offer, and I believe that those are some of the keys in men becoming allies in the workplace.
Absolutely. Well, this has been great. Annie, how can we learn more about you and your work?
So I have partnered with Herdacity. Molly Eierman and I have created a curriculum on Herdacity that's basically a slide deck that managers and HR departments can use to start conversations about sexism in the workplace. And I would recommend that anybody go to herdacity.org, sign up for an account. It's a nonprofit organization. They're just trying to raise the voices of women, and go ahead and download that deck to be able to better understand how they can start that conversation internally.
Perfect. Well, Annie, thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. I appreciate being able to have a voice in this conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm at Copeland Coach, and on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.